I'll start now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this online IHL Talk of the Geneva Academy, dedicated to responding to COVID-19 pandemia in conflict zones. Before giving the floor to Professor Marco Sassoli for short words of introductions, just let me explain a little bit about the logistics today. So we are doing this meeting on Zoom. It's a first for the Geneva Academy, and we have one of our colleagues, Tatiana Avante, who was in charge of admitting you to the meeting room and will be, doing the moderation from a Zoom perspective, so admitting people in and blocking microphones in case there is any hacking, because we know it has happened in previous meetings. We have also deactivated the feature that allows the recording of messages, at the end of the meeting, you won't be able to see all the private exchange you might have. So we're doing our best to preserve, everyone, if not privacy, but at least to make sure that we have some measures in place from a cybersecurity perspective. And also the way we'll proceed is Professor Marco Sassoli will give a few words of introduction, and then I'll introduce our panelists, which will both have about 15 minutes for their presentations. And then we will turn to the Q&A, and the way the Q&A will work is in the chat. If you could please write up your question, they will be addressed on the first come, first served basis, and I will read them out loud for everybody to be on the same page. And I see Professor Sassoli is adjusting his frame. And
yes,
back.
Exactly.
Wonderful. So I'm now happy to give you the floor for the introduction.
So good afternoon and welcome to the Geneva Academy. Unfortunately, I cannot welcome you to the Villa Moigné because the Villa Moigné, our headquarters, is closed, but the Geneva Academy continues to work online. In its teaching. We are very proud that we had not to let even one, we are very proud that we did not have to let even one lesson out of our masters, and the research continues, and today we resume the IHL talks, this one on the subject everyone is speaking these days about, the COVID-19, but an aspect which is unfortunately often forgotten, which is that obviously people who are simultaneously affected by an armed conflict are even much less well on than all the others. We have today at 3 another meeting online on fighting online hate speech and fake news in a global crisis. So we go well on. We will not only, and I hope very soon, not only speak about the coronavirus, but perhaps, in my opinion, have some thoughts on something very positive, which this crisis has shown, that at least within countries, there has been a great amount of solidarity by governments and the public with the most vulnerable. And one day we will have to think how similar efforts can be achieved beyond borders in fighting, for instance, against climate change or poverty, or to give just another pandemia, malaria. I remind you that in 2018, 405,000 people died from malaria, or closer to our expertise, how such a solidarity and readiness of the public to show solidarity can be achieved in face of human rights violations or disrespect of international humanitarian law, for instance, in Syria or in Yemen. But let us speak today about COVID-19, and I pass the floor to our moderator, Emilie Max. Please, Emilie.
Thank you so much, Professor Sassoli, for those introductory words. So we have the pleasure today to have two distinguished panelists with us, respectively from Geneva and from London. First, we have Fabrizio Carboni, who is the Regional Director for the Near and the Middle East at the International Committee of the Red Cross. And hopefully, Mr. Carboni will give us an operational humanitarian perspective on how the ICRC is tackling the current challenges related to COVID-19, especially in the region he's responsible for. And then we have Antonio Coco, who recently published a series of blog posts on state's due diligence and COVID-19 with his colleague Tatiana de Souza. And then Antonio is a lecturer at the School of Law at the University of Essex, a visiting fellow at the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, and also an expert and an alumnus of the Geneva Academy. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to you, Fabrizio.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the Geneva Academy to give me this opportunity to present an operational perspective on not the COVID crisis, but how the COVID impacted us and impacts the people in the region of the Near and Middle East, because I'm in charge of this region, Near and Middle East. And just to describe you a bit the region, or at least to give you a bit the extent of the region. This region includes in the ICRC Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Yemen, and all the GCC country, Iran, Iraq, and Israel and occupied territory. So the pandemic in a region like Near and Middle East is just an additional element. It's just an additional layer of misery. If you think at Iraq, it's still quite an unstable place, violent. Just a couple of weeks before the pandemic, we were talking about a direct confrontation between Iran and the US. And this didn't go away. It's still around. Iraq for us, it's tens of thousands of people in places of detention because of the coalition fight against the Islamic State group. It's still hundreds of thousands of IDPs who are not allowed to go back home. We can extend this to Syria. Just before the lockdown, the shutdown, I was a week in Syria, and it was all about Idlib. It was all about 1 million people displaced, probably one of the largest displacement, no, not probably, the largest displacement of population during these 10 years of conflict. And it's not just displacement of population, it's population who was targeted, who had very few access to basic services. And this took place during winter, while it was snowing, freezing. And obviously you can extend this to the 6-7 million refugees in the region because of the Syria crisis. You can have a look at Yemen, and after you can turn your head towards Palestine and in the occupied territory. So just, it needs to be clear that the environment, it's an environment where the COVID is just an additional element. The other important point to take into consideration, it's probably not to see this region as only through the angle of conflict, but to look at it through the angle of protracted crisis. Because I believe the protracted nature of the crisis facing this region helps us better understand what are the challenges today. So protracted crisis for us in the ICRC means that you have spikes of violence, of instability, but it's a situation which lasts, I mean, if we take Syria, we're going to get into 10 years of conflict. If you look at Iraq, I mean, you can go back to the 90s, it's maybe 20, 30 years of war and instability. And this has a consequence on First, the infrastructure of a country. It can be basic stuff as roads, as bridges, as pumping station, the energy grid, hospitals. After, it has an impact on systems, the health system, for instance, the educational system is disrupted by situation of protracted crisis. And the last point, it's HR. The human resources you need in a country, and now I'm talking about engineers, health professionals, educators, you name it. Most of the time, they either fled the country or don't have access anymore to a decent level of education. Just to give you an example, if we talk about Syria, the largest governorate in Syria, it's Homs, okay? And in Homs, we're talking about, I think, 7 or 8 million people. There is not a single general hospital left. So all the hospitals, I'm talking about general hospital, like the HUG you can have here in Geneva. I'm not even talking about the university hospital. It's destroyed, it's burned, it's gone. So you only have isolated health infrastructure, which are below standards in terms of capacity, in terms of medical material and supply. And when you talk about health in Syria, it's also very important to know that most of the trained medical staff has left. And in the case of Syria, it's even worse because, as you all know, medical staff and medical infrastructure were deliberately attacked during the 10 years of conflict. So it was really, health was to some extent weaponized in a conflict like Syria. So you have this environment. Another element also to understand is that we are, most of the time, in most of the contexts, we are in a very controlled environment. We have power states who put a lot of pressure on humanitarian actors, and there is no trust. Okay, there is no trust between authorities, governments, and humanitarian actors, and you have a huge bureaucracy, often dysfunctional, dedicated to control humanitarian actors. And often we hear this humanitarian actor complaining because states don't give access to the people in need. It's often considered as intentional, might be, but it's also the result of a huge bureaucracy, a huge inefficient bureaucracy, which blocks the whole process of access. And so we can imagine that in times of crisis and COVID, it makes things even more complicated, because in many of those contexts where we operate, there is no trust. It's a culture of control and security. And there is always in the back of the mind of state officials that at the end of the day, external powers, spy, you name it, will want to take advantage of the situation to push a political agenda, which is not a humanitarian one. So now, if we go back to the COVID and then the epidemic, I think one element which is, I think, common to probably what we saw in the West is that it's a bit the boiling frog situation. We saw it around us. We heard about it. We said, yes, it might happen, but it went very fast. And in no time, we find ourselves in many operations locked down. And it's something which happened very, very, very fast. And it's still something which remains to be explained, but to some extent we were caught by surprise. Mm-hmm. We anticipated, but we did anticipate it to the point that it would be ready to deal with this situation. There is maybe a parallel to be done with Western countries. We probably felt that it couldn't happen to us, or if it did, we would find ways to manage it, and at the end of the day, it would not be a big deal. Mm-hmm. I mean, probably, let's see in a couple of months or years what is going to be the explanation. But yes, the other thing which is also remarkable is that for the first time, I mean, not the first time, but as a humanitarian actors, we were not only there to help, we were not only there to the victim was somebody else. And for the first time, we were also the victim. Mm-hmm. You know, and it might sound a bit strange, but it changed the perspective. The other perspective which changed is that Geneva is the headquarter, is the safe place. Home is the safe place. Europe is the safe place for us as humanitarian, because we work in situation of conflict. And so this is where we go when we want to be safe. And this change, I mean, Geneva, or even for our colleague coming from Italy, was in lockdown before Yemen, Iraq, Syria, or even, Lebanon. So it was also a bit destabilizing that we didn't have anymore a central safe place. And in Geneva, it really took us a week to readjust. There was a focus on business continuity at one stage at the Geneva level, which was quite surprising, because normally our offices in the fields, even if they have a lot of autonomy, the Geneva, the headquarter is the backup. And here we were not anymore the backup. And let's see how it goes in the coming weeks and months. The other element which also caught us by surprise is restriction of movements. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to be stranded, let's say, to be isolated or quarantined in Geneva or in London. It's another thing to be stuck in Odeida, mm-hmm. or to be in Aden, or to be in Baghdad. And Baghdad, by the way, it's okay. But if you are, I don't know, in Mosul, you're in Tikrit, this is a totally different ballgame. We also have people who are stranded in between locations. For instance, we have Djibouti. Djibouti is an important hub for us to work in Yemen. And we have tens of colleagues who are stuck in Djibouti, mm-hmm. who can't go to Yemen because the Yemeni authorities have a very strict policy when it comes to foreigners going to Yemen. And most of them cannot go back home, mm-hmm. Because there are no flights. Yeah. So you stuck in Djibouti. And as I said, Djibouti is still... it's still okay, you know. For the one block in Najaf or Odeida, it's a different situation. The third element is logistic. You need goods to be relevant in such a place, to be relevant in such a situation. So for the normal activities, we had the pipeline in place. And we're going to talk about it later, but obviously the challenge is, how do you adjust your operation, and how do you develop your operation? You know, what are the new things you need to do? And for this to happen, you need a very robust logistic pipeline. Mm-hmm. And this COVID crisis is highly disruptive. Is highly disruptive because, for instance, planes or pilots are not willing to fly to some countries because they know that they'll have to be quarantined for 2 weeks when they're back. So you really need to find the right person to do that. You have countries who have national security law allowing them to take all medical supply in their country and not allowing them to move outside. You have border closed. So the logistic is obviously another big challenge for us. And now one of the track is to engage states to allow a humanitarian exception. A humanitarian exception to move people and to move goods. It's a tough one, especially when you have to negotiate this in countries which are themselves surviving, which try themselves to find a solution to something which is quite challenging. But I would say that we're getting there. The other challenge is that the new supply we need to adjust our operation is just not available on the market. You know, the famous PPE, the famous mask, the famous protective gears. I mean, if we want to continue our operation in detention, for instance, I mean, we can't just send our colleagues in a place of detention without the protective gears. And today, it's very difficult to find them on the market. The supply are very difficult, and we are in competition with states. And states are ready to pay 2, 3, 4, 5 times the price to put their hands on the supplies. It's true for the PPE, but it's true for respirators, it's true for testing, it's true for pretty much everything. It's a ruthless battle to get this there. And what is really shocking, because I was confronted with this last week, it's business. It's really business. I mean, there is no mercy, I would say. If you are, I mean, not all of them, but I would say if you are a producer of a given goods which is needed, I mean, the price will increase. And obviously, as humanitarian, we are sometimes a bit naive, and we always expect that people, you know, in such a global crisis with such a disruptive effect, you would expect that, you know, some decency, or at least the way we define decency in the humanitarian world. But no, forget it. It's not the case. Now I'm going to list four elements which are, I think, important for us, which are really a challenge for us. And after I will pass to the 3 operational axes of our answers. So the first one, it's what to do. You know, as humanitarian, what do you do when you watch TV and you see that the New York health system can't cope with the situation? When you see that Italy and the richest region of Italy, like Lombardy and in a city like Bergamo, were totally crushed by this pandemic. It really raises a lot of questions as humanitarian. What can be your contribution which can have an impact? And you need to define this impact. And obviously you need to be very humble. The other one is to manage expectations. Manage expectation mainly of states who are facing these challenges. I would say the states which are the less mature are often expecting way too much from humanitarian actors. And I would say the states who are traditional donors of humanitarian actors are also expecting us to do way more than what we can reasonably do.
Mm-hmm.
So the other one is to manage expectation. The major challenge for all our teams, we have a call with all the ICIC head of delegation of the region every week. The main challenge they have is to manage the staff.
Mm-hmm.
To manage the staff because there is fear. If you are an international staff, I'll give you an example. Today, Iraq, normally every 6 weeks, staff is allowed to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Allowed to leave because they're not allowed to take their family with them. It's to see their kids, to have a break. I have staff who most of the staff is stuck in Iraq today. So you need to manage their fear, the frustration, not knowing, just the basic stuff, when I'm going to see my kids again.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of our head of delegation are people with a lot of experience, and those people have decided to leave their family at home.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you, for the ones who have kids, this is a big, big sacrifice. And in two contexts, my head of delegation, it's more than 4 months that they haven't seen their family.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds maybe anecdotal in front of the challenge, but if you want people to function in such a challenging environment, this is something which you need to address and find. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that some of the activities we had to stop them because there was just no space to continue carrying these activities. But the people in charge of those activities are still stuck. So it's one thing to manage people who are stuck but have something to do. Mm-hmm. And it's another thing to manage people who are stuck and have nothing to do. Mm-hmm. Finally, it's also the duty of care with our staff, but I'm going to talk about it after. And the last point, which is a very big source of stress, it's the funding. Mm-hmm. We don't know how are we going to be funded. And the ICIC, our funding model is thought in a way that gives us independence and gives us the capacity to dedicate its staff and resources according to the need. So what we do is that we start the year with stating our ambition, and we start operating, not waiting for the money to come in. Okay? Now, the risk we face is that all the predictable resources we could have to cover our activities are going to be either redirected to a COVID response, or will just be cut, because traditional donor states are facing themselves a crisis, and they might cut our operation. Yeah. So we find ourselves in a very challenging environment today. And now, just to finish, I could speak hours, obviously, about our operation, and after I'm happy to answer to your question. We have today 3, I would say, axes of work. The first one is the duty of care for our own staff. I mean, it doesn't make sense to have our staff exposed, to have our staff infected. And it doesn't make sense for 2 reasons. First, if our staff is infected in, let's say, Yemen, the possibility for us to evacuate our staff towards health facility, I would say with decent level of care, it's not very high. Let's put it like this. And the second one, if our staff is infected, it's obviously our operation who are stopping. So this is a very big challenge, and we manage duty of care as we manage security, which means that it's not an absolute. We balance the duty of care with the activity we want to achieve. Obviously, if we talking about a life-saving activity, the balance between duty of care and the activity would be different than if the activity is just, with all due respect to IHL, if it's a training for army on IHL, we're obviously not going to take the same risk if it's a war surgery, if it's the deployment of a surgical team. So so this duty of care is a very tough one, and it's one of the big axes of our work. The second one is business continuity. We need to be in a position to still function, and it was not a given that we could keep on functioning without being in the office, but not just being in the office in Geneva. It's all around the world. We have 20,000 staff. So how do you function? How do you keep on functioning with 20,000 staff around the world? We had to decide to stop activities and to reprioritize our efforts. So that was the second big chunk. And the third one is to adjust our activities. So as I explained, we are in a protracted crisis. So protracted crises mean that you cannot just focus on the COVID response. I give you an example. The COVID response, the first, I would say, answer, which is prevention, it's physical distancing. I mean, physical distancing in Europe, it's not always very easy, but you have running water. You have markets around the corner. And most of us have either salaries, regular salaries coming, or we have some savings, or the state is providing or trying to provide the needed financial resources for the most vulnerable in our Western society to cope with this. But if you go to places like Syria, you have 4 million people who are directly dependent on food support from the humanitarian community. If you add the fact that 60 to 70% of the economy in a place like this, it's an informal economy, which means that these are mainly daily workers who every day need to get out to find resources to provide food for their family. So if you integrate this dimension into the whole COVID response, it means that the normal and traditional activity needs to continue. The food distribution needs to continue. The cash distribution needs to continue. The work on pumping station and water supply needs to continue. So, and in parallel to this, you need to adjust your response to address the COVID crisis. When it comes to the COVID crisis, we decide to focus on area where we have an expertise and where we feel we bring something different. And we decide to focus mainly on prisons, because you can imagine prison around the world, not just in conflict, in countries affected by conflict. Overcrowding is a major issue. I mean, even here in the West. So overcrowded place with limited basic services, with weak health facilities. Just imagine what can happen should detainees be infected by COVID. And by the way, often in those places of detention, you already have tuberculosis. So you put on top of this COVID and it's a disaster. The other population is IDPs, which is really a big focus for us. And finally, the National Society, the Red Crescent, Red Cross, National Society are often frontline responders in such a crisis, and we dedicate a lot of time and resources to support them.
Fabrizio, can you make one last point so then I can give the floor to Antonio?
I mean, that was my last point.
Oh, wonderful.
So I would say a very challenging environment because it's constantly evolving. We are often improvising, and it's hard for us to project ourselves beyond 1, 2, 3 weeks. And it's one of the most challenging, I would say, an environment I have seen in my career. And one of the reasons is because there is no more safe space.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this presentation. What I take away from it is that it's the COVID-19, is adding a layer of complexity to work in already complex and difficult environment, and it forces an organization as big as the ICRC to take nothing for granted and reimagine the way it works. And I can only imagine how challenging that is. And now I'm happy to give the floor to Antonio Coco, who is going to present a little bit more of a legal and a state, if not belligerent-centric perspective. So a little bit of the other side of the same coin in that regard. Antonio, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Emilie, and thank you, Fabrizio. And you said, well, I'm going to present a state-centric perspective with occasional references to non-state actors, if the case, because my research has been on states' duties of due diligence in general in international law. Actually, my research on COVID-19 and due diligence is just a spin-off of a research that I'm conducting in Oxford on cyber due diligence. So I applied the knowledge that I gained on states' obligations of due diligence to the COVID-19 context. And now today, I want to go through some of these international obligations and see if and how they can apply in a conflict scenario. Of course, in non-international armed conflicts, there may be a problem with applying these obligations, and I'll mention it when the time comes. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation. I hope you're all seeing it, just to help you to follow the development of my presentation. And what will I talk about? Well, first of all, I'll tell you a little bit about the concept of due diligence in international law and what it means, what it entails, why I chose to look at the current crisis under these lenses. This, of course, is not just discussion in theory, but it's an analysis of existing international obligations that are applicable even in a time of crisis like the present one, and even yes.
Have you shared the presentation already?
Yeah, I have shared it. Can you see it?
Actually, no.
No. Let me try again. Let's see. There must have been a problem. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, I didn't click with enough.
Yes, now we can see it.
Now you can see. Yes.
Yes. Thanks.
Yeah. So there was a nice cover, but it's okay. It doesn't matter. Sorry for that. I told you about the structure of what I'm about to say. So we're gonna look at the relevant legal framework, and then I'm gonna start looking at specific obligations of due diligence that would apply even in conflict zones. There is, first of all, an obligation to monitor and report epidemiologic evidence and cases related to the disease and communicate these data to relevant authorities. There is an obligation to build emergency response capacity and to build preparedness for epidemics that would precede the spread and the insurgence of the epidemic, and that would apply to every state in the world. There are obligations once the epidemic has started to contain it and mitigate its effects. And there are obligations to cooperate with other international actors to address the problems generated by the outbreak of the epidemic. Mm-hmm. So what is this due diligence that I've been mentioning? It's a very general expression. that designates a standard of good governance, duty of care. It's generally used to designate the type of conduct the states are required to adopt when complying with obligations of means, not with obligations of result. Mm-hmm. So whenever a state is under an obligation to give its best efforts to do something, which in our case is address risks, threats, or harms related in particular to the epidemic, giving its best efforts is normally designated with the expression due diligence. So doing due diligence or exercising due diligence. This is reflected in a multitude of international legal obligations. So there is not one rule of due diligence in international law, despite the debate in the literature sometimes is confused by scholars trying to bring everything under this umbrella without acknowledging the differences between the relevant obligations. There are obligations in human rights law, obligations in IHL, and so on and so forth, that require, in order to be complied with, a standard of due diligence. Now, typically, all these obligations require states to do something to either prevent or stop or redress some sort of harm or risk. Mm-hmm. However, the obligations usually arise only once the state or the relevant international actor has knowledge or constructive knowledge of these risks, that there is a harm or of the harm itself. By constructive knowledge, I mean that the state, by the circumstances, should have known that this risk was present or that the harm is being caused by something beyond the state's control. So why I am adopting these lenses to look at the COVID-19 crisis, and why is it important even and especially, I would say, in conflict zones? Because using the due diligence framework allows to account for all the obstacles to effective prevention and effective mitigation. In other words, since this is an obligation of conduct and due diligence reflects an approach by which a state gives its best efforts, if there are objective obstacles and limits to the achievement of the result, these will allow the state to still be in compliance with its international obligations, as long as they did everything that was feasible, everything that was practicable under the circumstances. It leaves states a margin of appreciation in the choice of the measures that they want to implement, and it takes into account the capabilities from a financial, human, or technical perspective, takes into account the objective difficulties of the situation. And there is a dimension that it's quite important if we look at the bigger picture of the balance between various states on the international arena. It expects more of states that have more resources and less of states that have less resources. So it's the so-called Spider-Man principle. With great power, great responsibility. So states that have enough resources, enough expertise are expected to do more. And of course, this is immediately relevant in conflict areas, because states that are involved in an armed conflict, or other actors, to the extent that we may give them some obligations of due diligence, will necessarily be expected to do less, which doesn't mean doing nothing. Because this is one of the misconceptions about due diligence, that due to its flexibility, there may be a perception that states or other international actors are okay even if they do not achieve anything. But there is an obligation of trying. And to the extent that the relevant actors do not try, do not give their best effort to, in this case, prevent the outbreak or mitigate its effects, then they are in violation of all these obligations that I'm going to mention in a minute. So, of course, in a conflict areas, Fabrizio mentioned, and for this reason I will not delve too much with that, there are increased risks, lack of water and sanitation, people congregating more often, impracticability of social distancing, and so on and so forth. Compliance, however, with the obligations of due diligence is also affected by several other factors. First of all, due diligence varies in its implementation depending on the control that the relevant actor has over the territory and over the population. You can understand, of course, that an armed group, if an armed group has an obligation of due diligence, that depends on the specific legal framework applicable. The expectations of compliance will depend hugely on the degree of control that they have over the territory. And the same goes for a state that's involved in an armed conflict, in which they may have lost partially or totally control over the territory. Compliance with due diligence standards also depends on the availability of resources, which may be scarce for parties engaged in an armed conflict. And some of the resources that normally we would expect a peaceful country to devote to the national health system may be necessary for a bunch of other reasons in a conflict area. And this is why ceasefires at the moment are crucial in order to divert resources that are usually employed for fighting and hostility-related endeavors to instead the protection of health and life of people that are affected by the pandemic. Availability of expertise, of course, that there needs to be some degree of awareness of what the disease is, and this means that you need people able to recognize it. If you do not recognize it, there is no way to adopt any measures. And in conflict areas, there may be comparatively less people that are able to do this assessment and know what to do with the data that have been collected. And finally, there may be problems with the availability of channels for communication and cooperation. One of the main dimensions of due diligence with respect to COVID-19 is international cooperation. But we may understand that some actors that are involved in armed conflicts may have a reduced capability for communication with other international actors due to political calculations, for example. An armed group may not have the chance to talk to other states, also because of their different legal personality. Even a state that's involved in a conflict may have decided to abandon its communication channels with other states with which there is a friction precisely because of the conflict, and so on and so forth. All these are obstacles that in turn determine the extent to which we can and we must expect states to abide by their due diligence obligations. So I've been talking in very general terms so far, but let's have a look at what are these international obligations that I've been mentioning. One of the most general is the so-called no harm principle. That's a general principle of international law, applicable basically in all circumstances. It goes back to very old arbitration cases like the Trails Melter arbitration, or to cases before the International Court of Justice. I mean, you can find all the references in the blog post that I've written. But in essence, it's an obligation to prevent, stop, and redress any significant transboundary harm that may be caused to other states from activities that originate within a certain state territory. Now, of course, an epidemic may constitute significant transboundary harm. In order to comply with this principle, states have to do everything feasible and everything reasonable to avoid that the contagion spreads to other countries, even if these states are involved in an armed conflict. This principle is not affected by an armed conflict, if not to the degree of compliance that we may expect. But some form of compliance, some form of measure to prevent the contagion to spread further to other neighboring countries is necessary, even in conflict zones. There are positive obligations under international human rights law. As we know, international human rights law keeps applying in armed conflicts. These obligations have to do with a number of rights. Two of the main ones, those of most immediate relevance, are the right to life and the right to health. And I'll show you shortly what kind of measures are states expected to put in place in order to guarantee the protection of the right to life and the right to health to population affected by COVID-19 or any other epidemic, really. There are obligations that come from the international health regulations. This is not a treaty, but it's still a binding legal instrument that was that's related to the World Health Organization system, and it does produce binding legal effects on a very high number of states. Almost all the states in the world are bound by these international health regulations that were adopted in 2005. And they provide obligations with respect to monitoring and capacity building and cooperation with respect to pandemics that are binding on states involved in conflicts as well. There is a huge variety of rules composing the international disaster law framework. I will not deal very much in detail with these. There are some articles issued by the International Law Commission in 2016 that are deemed to constitute customary international law and that deal with disaster response. There are obligations, even for parties involved in armed conflicts, to adopt some measures to reduce the risk of disasters from occurring and mitigating their effects. And then there are some obligations under international humanitarian law that involve an obligation of diligent conduct. Some have to do with collecting and caring for the sick, even in an armed conflict. Some have to do with ensuring humanitarian relief and ensuring that humanitarian relief is provided to the population when the population is in need. There are some obligations that pertain specifically to occupying powers with respect to ensuring and maintaining the hospital establishments and public health and hygiene. Of course, I'm incredibly oversimplifying all these, but you understand we're talking about a huge amount of law in a sense. So I said there are four main types of obligations of due diligence that very rich legal framework generates. The first type is obligations of monitoring and reporting. So according to the international health regulations, every state has a duty to develop, maintain, and strengthen the capacity to detect, assess, notify, and report manifestations of diseases or occurrences creating potential for diseases. This obligation continues to apply even if the country is involved in an armed conflict, of course. The obligation is not, strictly speaking, applicable to armed groups, but we will see that there are comparable rules applicable in a minute. Similar obligations come from the no harm principle as a specification of the principle, or from the rules on disaster risk reduction, and also human rights law, in as far as it requires protection for the right to life and health, requires some sort of monitoring in order to provide effective measures of protection. So the Human Rights Committee, it's the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, there is a mistake in my slide, in its General Comment 14 has said that one of the measures that's necessary to guarantee the right to health is using and improving epidemiological surveillance and data collection in order to shape the future response. Now, how do non-state actors come into play? Well, we need to take a leap here in order to give them some obligations of this kind. And to the extent that we may accept that non-state actors have human rights obligations, which is something which is object of debate, of course, but to the extent that one accepts that, these obligations, especially those deriving from human rights law, would apply to them as well. There are other duties of due diligence related to response capacity and preparedness. Once again, here I start with the international health regulations, which are the most detailed in this respect, and they provide for a duty to develop, maintain, implement capacity to respond promptly and effectively to public health risks and public health emergencies of international concern. These involves, and in order to comply with no-harm principle, states are expected to put in place relevant legislation, administrative policies, regulation. The same comes from the framework of disaster risk reduction law. States are obliged, for example, to plan for emergencies in advance, stockpile equipment, and so on and so forth. If we look through the lenses of international human rights law, the same. There are positive obligations by states to provide for effective emergency health services, plan in advance for emergencies, basically, without the need of the emergency to start. Think before it could occur, about putting in place a system that could cope with a very contagious epidemic. Now, if we move this framework to the conflict zones, of course, here there may be some situations in which states may have put in place the measures, but then the conflict occurred and all this preparation went out the window. But there may also be situations in which the states didn't even get a chance to adopt these capacity response and response capacity and preparedness measures. To a very core minimum, these obligations keep to apply even to states that are involved in an armed conflict. So there must be some plan to cope with epidemics, even by states that are involved in an armed conflict. It's not an admissible excuse to say, I was involved in a conflict, I could not get enough masks even for the health personnel, or I could not provide for a few intensive care units, or I could not provide for transfer of people to one area which is less affected by the conflict, and so on and so forth. States who want to be in compliance with these obligations need to show that even in a conflict, they have done the maximum that they could do to ensure that they were ready to respond to the epidemic. Once the epidemic has started, there are certain obligations relating to mitigation of the epidemic and containment of the epidemic. Of course, first and foremost, the duty to avoid that the epidemic spreads outside of the boundary of the states, no harm principle here. There is a duty to mitigate effects of disasters that comes from a breeding of many obligations in the disaster response management law. And there are obligations under human rights law, for example, obligations to establish prevention and education programs that address health concerns that are related to behavior of people. So there is an obligation, for example, to implement social distancing measures to the extent possible, because this is social behavior that would help the spread of the disease, contact between people. There is a duty to give effective information to the public. So states must inform the public of the appropriate practices to mitigate and halt the contagion, and so on and so forth. These, in a sense, keep applying in armed conflict. In particular, here I mentioned, I reference the general comment on the right to health, general comment 14. Once again, it's the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, not the Human Rights Committee. This right, the right to health, is a right that's subject to progressive realization. Progressive realization doesn't mean that states are allowed to say, sorry, we are fighting a war, we don't have any resources, and so we can't do anything. There must be a sincere, genuine, good faith attempt to do what's possible with this respect, at least as a matter of law. Then I understand that in practice, it may be very difficult. But at least a show of good faith is necessary in order not to commit violations of international law, and add then to the already bad situation of the pandemic. Finally, there are duties of due diligence to enter in a dialogue with other states and the relevant international organizations, WHO in particular. The main provision in this respect is Article 44 of the International Health Regulations that provides for a duty to collaborate with other states to detect, assess, and respond to public health emergencies, develop, strengthen, and maintain the public health capacity, and mobilize financial resources. this obligation will be crucial once states that have a higher capacity will be ahead with the response to the disease and will be in a better position to help the states that are still involved in the active contagion and the active outbreak. In other words, states that, for reasons related to conflict, for example, may suffer from a lack of capacity and resources, may seek external assistance, and there is, at least on paper, a duty for states that have the possibility to do so to help. It's not a moral duty only, it's a legal duty. And since we see that the spread of this disease is asynchronous, so various areas in the world are being affected at different times, these may help in securing and mobilizing international assistance to the countries that are still suffering. And we have seen so far that some countries in the global south are behind in the chronology of the outbreak. An existence of a strong duty to assist and to cooperate may help mitigate the effects in those countries, the effects of the epidemic. Okay, with this, I have finished my presentation. I really had to simplify a lot, so I will clarify anything during the Q&A session if there is a need.
Thank you so much, Antonio. We're running a bit late on schedule, but we have 5 questions so far in the chat. So if you all have a little bit of patience, we might finish after 1:45, but I think those are interesting questions that are worth addressing. Thank you, Antonio, also for the presentation, because I think it shows that, at least, you know, from a legal perspective, there are quite high standards for states to respond to the COVID outbreak, and maybe also standards that could, if applied correctly, allow to move from the business model that Fabrizio was describing with regards to, you know, bidding for essential supplies, but to a more cooperative framework. So we have 5 questions, well, 6 questions, I'm sorry. I think 4 are more for Fabrizio because they relate to the work of the ICRC, and 2 are more for Antonio. So I suggest to start maybe with 2 questions for Fabrizio, then 2 questions for you, Antonio, and then finish with Fabrizio. So the first question that was asked in chronological order, comes from Peter Grove, and he's interested to know whether the current context of the COVID-19 has or might create opportunity for relaxing sanctions regime to remove obstacles to humanitarian public health responses. He was referring to Iran, but we also know that the UN has a very robust sanction regime that also impacts the Middle East. So whether, you know, it would be an opportunity to relax those. And the second question comes from Grace Stephan, and she was asking whether the ICRC actually collects data on which parties to the conflict have declared a ceasefire in relation to COVID response.
Okay, when it comes to sanctions, we would love to, but we don't see a sign of this happening. Now, something which needs to be stressed is that those sanctions have humanitarian exceptions. Yes. So there is, if I look at Iran, to transport goods into Iran, it's manageable. Okay. The challenge is the financial support. Mm-hmm. to channel funds into Iran. That's way more complicated. But now we focus on we have a narrow view of the sanction as humanitarian actors. But what is really interesting, if we take into consideration the protracted nature of the crisis, and if you look at Syria, mm-hmm. Syria today, because of the sanction, and I'm not expressing an opinion on whether or not these sanctions are needed, but there is a huge financial crisis. Yeah. The Syria pound collapsed, mm-hmm. and there was a ripple effect on Lebanon. Yeah. So I see no relaxing of those sanctions, and now it needs to be said that within these sanctions you have humanitarian exceptions. Now, once you need to take into consideration the impact of sanction on the economy and the capacity of a country to address this pandemic. Ceasefire, no, to my knowledge, we have no database on ceasefire. And if I'm talking about the region I cover, we would not need a very big database, to be honest. So quite limited, the ceasefire.
Okay. Well, on ceasefire, one of our participants has shared a database on the chat with all the ceasefires that have been recorded. So thanks to Michela Luzzi for sharing the database. Now we'll turn to two questions for Antonio. The first one was asked by Omran Abdul Rahim, and it relates to duty of the occupying power to guarantee health, hygiene, and preventive measures. So the question is, it is known that under the rules of IHL, some measures can be justified in determining the duty of the occupying power to guarantee health, hygiene, and hygienes. In contrast, are there rules of IHL that applies to NIAC and in particular to armed groups in this regard? And the second question was asked by Annie S., who is writing from Nagorno-Karabakh. And so it says, we were just listening to how difficult it is to ensure humanitarian aid to recognize states in conflict situations. So you could imagine that unrecognized states, such as Nagorno-Karabakh, face even bigger challenges to get access for humanitarian relief, as there is zero interaction with UN specialized agencies. Of course, ICRC is trying to cope with the situation, and so on and so forth. What can states like Nagorno-Karabakh, so states that technically have no standing under international law, should and can do not to be left beyond the margins of the global action and get access to humanitarian assistance and agencies? I guess it's a question that Fabrizio could address as well if you wanted to.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'll address the first question first.
Yes.
So with respect to what can non-state actors do, first of all, I recommend a blog post by Ezequiel Hefis and Marcos Kotlik on Opinio Juris on
yes,
this.
It's good.
Exactly. To the extent that the territory upon which non-state armed groups operate is territory that still technically belongs to a state, that state has a residual obligation to do something.
Yes.
And basically comply with its own due diligence insofar as possible, even though it has lost control over the territory. This may entail, for example, facilitating provision of humanitarian relief materials or provision of medicines and so on and so forth. It sounds counterintuitive because it's, after all, sometimes it would be providing resources to the enemy. But technically, there is no reason why the duty to protect the human rights of the human beings living in a territory that technically belongs to the state should completely be foregone. It still applies. Of course, there will be limitations. No one expects the impossible of these states, and nobody expects the impossible of the armed groups. But technically, there is something that they could do, establishing a dialogue. For the armed group itself, in terms of legal obligations that they may have, of course, there are some obligations coming from IHL, even for armed groups. I mean, there is I think, Common Article 3 in itself, and customary international humanitarian law of NIACs provide for duties to collect and care for sick people. It's a very basic duty, but to the extent possible, this could be developed into adopting measures to address the epidemic. And as a matter of fact, many armed groups have started adopting measures to guarantee protection for life of the people under their control at the moment.
Thank you.
Yeah, and with respect to states that are not recognized, I mean, very similar considerations. It's tough because some the other states may not see them as peers, but the important thing is to try to establish a communication channel.
Yeah.
And to the extent that these entities perceive themselves to be states that are simply not recognized by other ones, but they are states, they are bound by the relevant international obligations that I have described.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Fabrizio, do you want to add something on this point or no? Your microphone is off, I think.
No, I have nothing to add. I mean, again, what we need to take into consideration, I think, in this crisis is the tension between what one needs to do, or no, what one has to do, and what it can really do.
Yeah.
And this gap is always present, even in more normal times, in situation of conflict, but it's even more acute today.
Yeah. Thank you. So we have two more questions, actually three more questions for you, Fabrizio, and one for you, and one for you, Antonio. So the first question is from Amira Hanafi, and she's asking, or he, I think it's a she, asking whether there are any negotiations going on releasing prisoners in conflict areas, because as we've seen, in Western states, some prisoners have been released to decrease the population in detention centers to fight COVID. So is this something that the ICRC is undertaking? And then we have Claudia Moser, who's asking, is there an impact of COVID on the ICRC's work for CTA and RFL? RFL, I know, is Restoring Family Links, but CTA, I'm not familiar with the acronym.
Central Tracing Agency.
Thank you. And then Antonio, there is, one question that is addressed to both you and Fabrizio. So for Fabrizio, the question for you is, what steps is ICRC taking regarding prisoners of conscience in the Middle East? So I think you can address it maybe as the question with regards to ICRC's work on detainees. And then Antonio, one last question for you. What steps can be taken by civil society and non-state actors to encourage greater international cooperation? So I suggest we start with you, Fabrizio, if it's okay.
Yes. So the first thing, I mean, ICRC is not in the business of releasing detainees.
No.
I have my personal opinion, but our work it's to focus on condition of detention and respect of due process.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, we're not going to review judicial cases, but we will look at systems and we say, look, we will intervene to states and say, in our view, due process is not guaranteed in such an environment and with such a legislation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what we can do is to ask for humanitarian release because a person is very sick, because we believe that there are very specific conditions which would justify that a person is released. But it's quite exceptional, very exceptional. Now, I mean, we haven't reached a point where we ask for release. Today, we're not there.
Yeah.
The overcrowding situation, the pressure on the health system is there. We are aware of it, but for the time being, we haven't reached this point. Now, in parallel to asking for the release of detainees because of the COVID situation, we are involved in the release of detainees. It's not because we asked for it. For instance, you all know within the Stockholm Agreement for Yemen, there is a provision on the release of detainees, and we are actively involved in this release of detainees. But you can imagine that to do release of detainees in times of COVID, it's quite a logistic challenge. So I would say that's where we are on the release of detainees. Now, CTA, RFL, I think there is one aspect where we see an increased need. It's in detention, because obviously physical distancing means that people don't receive visit anymore.
Yeah.
And for people who are in detention, especially in detention in places, in prisons in the Near and Middle East, not having family visit or family contact is an additional strain on conditional detention. And so there we have organized a mechanism of phone calls. We also, for instance, in Yemen, you have a lot of migrants who are stranded in Yemen. And so we have also worked on, providing SIM cards, providing tools for stranded migrants to contact their families. So I would say, yes, physical distancing obliges to look differently on how to keep contacts, how people can keep contact with their family.
Thank you. Antonio?
Yes, so about civil society and non-state actors in general. Well, for civil society, I think advocacy is the main thing that can be done. Well, not the main, but one of the things that can be done is reminding states and relevant international actors that they have obligations under international law, that it's not just because of goodwill or because of a moral duty that they have to adopt containment measures and cooperation, but they are obliged by law to do so. And there can be examples of measures of mitigation prevention that can be provided by civil society to states. For example, here in the UK, the government has started a process of consultation whereby everybody can submit evidence. And of course, reminding the UK of its duty to cooperate solidarily with other states, it's something that civil society can do. And these, of course, coupled with offers of, I don't know, capacity building, provision of relevant equipment, it's still the civil society that can campaign, fundraise to get masks, to get ventilators, and so on and so forth. This can be done to help states that are the primary duty bearers. For non-state actors, as I said, the obligations that I described only to a limited extent apply to them. Of course, the IHL obligations apply to parties to an armed conflict, even though they are not a state, and to some extent human rights law, with some caveats. But yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Antonio. Thank you so much, Fabrizio. I think on this note, we will conclude today's event. I hope that you have all find it interesting and enlightening. I'm hopefully a little bit hopeful. And light. Thank you so much to about the 95 of you who have tuned in and who have actively participated, including by sharing links and asking questions. I think we can call this, for a trial run of online event quite a success. If you are interested in the Academy convening another event, either on COVID-19 or other related theme, as Professor Sassoli mentioned, please drop me an email. You can find my contacts on the website of the Geneva Academy. Otherwise, I wish you all a good afternoon and stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.